Today, I get the honor of sharing with you all some overviews of white supremacy culture and systems thinking and how that fits into our work. And before I get into the content, I do want to acknowledge that I am on the unceded lands of the Nisenan, Maidu, and Miwok peoples, and that I am continuing to do my work as a new resident of the Sacramento region and area to understand the living stories, the living names of this place and the stewards here. I also want to say thank you to the Lishan Ohlone and Ramaytush Ohlone people who are the stewards of my birthplace and the place where I grew up. I also want to acknowledge the people of the African diaspora who have been stewards and continue to be stewards of this land and this culture as well. If folks are new to land and people's acknowledgements, I provide, I'll share a few resources, but this is just baby steps into developing our language, our understanding, and really at the end, our relationships with Native stewards, right? That's the goal in terms of land acknowledgements. I'm happy to share this slide deck and all these resources later on. So hi, my name is Catherine Canton. I'm the Race and Equity Manager. I've been on with the agency for about 10 months now, and this is my first official presentation to the council. So I'm going to go a little bit more into my philosophy, my facilitation philosophy, and kind of the framework for racial equity that I'm bringing into this institution. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. And yeah, so I really want to start with who my people are. My people are second gen. My people are detribalized and re-indigenizing. My people are Quiche, Guatemalan. My people are caregivers, cultural organizers, facilitators, puzzle makers, weavers, and healers, and avid collectors, and sometimes readers of books. I really do try my best. And part of this work that I want to make explicit is that I am not here by myself, that my work is in a legacy, in a lineage. And these folks' names and resources and frameworks are just a fraction of the reasons why I am here and why I am able to share and help steward the CAC's racial equity practices. So I want to thank Ebony, Dia, Shay, the Sorority Land Trust, Devi, Alyssa, Rhiannon. I learned from Emergent Strategy and Adrienne Marie Brown. I learned from Leah Lakshmi and Beyond Survival. I learned from the many disability justice organizers who are in my sphere. I learned from healers like Resma Menachem. I learned from writers and observers like Tema Oken. I learned from artists and Afrofuturists like Octavia Butler and Audre Lorde and many more. And I share this again, just as part of my framework. These folks and these teachers are part of my racial equity framework. So I believe in talking about and making explicit our lineage, especially as I am facilitating a training today. So our outcomes for this about hour together is that at the end, council members will be able to see the relationship between government, our role within government, white supremacy culture, and racial equity practices. Council members will expand your toolbox for racial equity. And I just want to make explicit that every single part of this training / presentation is a racial equity practice, is one of my racial equity practices. So any part of this, all parts of this have been really intentionally curated. And I'm happy to share the thinking behind any of these elements with you all at any point. At the end, council members will see how systems thinking fits into your decision making and be able to identify an opportunity, hopefully coming up, to try on a systems thinking approach. And one thing, or a couple things I want to add here as well is you all are in so many different places. Some of you may have like deep racial equity skill sets, and a deep understanding of systems thinking approach. And I encourage you all to use this time to think about, to one, have curiosity on. So put your curiosity hat or lens or whatever represents curiosity for you on, and see if anything new comes up. And two, if you have these skill sets and this knowledge already, what are the other opportunities that you can bring these conversations and skills into council committee meetings, or other council meetings? So as we get started, again, I'm like all about this book, very worn and very much loved. If you haven't read Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change, Changing Worlds by Adrienne Marie Brown, I highly recommend it. It's basically an approach on organizing and facilitating that provides space for adaptation based on constant reflection and awareness building, iteration, experimentation leading to data collection, then evaluation, and then integrating that evaluation into organizational learning. And it's really about the cycle of change. And I think we're all about that at this point. So I'm bringing in the concept of practice making practice, again, speaking the words of Adrienne Marie Brown and many others, because that's what this is. This is a moment for us to practice. It's gonna be messy. We're gonna make mistakes. We're gonna have aha moments, and that's super important for all of us to hold that space together. And I hope you feel that throughout this training. I'm also gonna read 2 excerpts. Nothing is wasted or a failure. Emergence is a system that makes use of everything in the iterative process. It's all data. And by that, I mean the emotional feelings that come up, the questions that come up, the physical sensations that come up during any conversations around systemic racism, white supremacy culture, systems thinking, racial equity, that's all data. And I encourage you all as council members and as participants and receivers and engaging in this training to track that, to take moments throughout this training to just make note of what's happening for you, what questions are coming up for you. The second piece is, in the framework of emergence, the whole is a mirror of the parts. Existence is fractal. The health of the cell is the health of the species and the planet. And for that illuminates a systems thinking approach to me, where we toggle between the micro and the macro, the individual, the collective, the organizational and the systemic, and we go back and forth. So I'm encouraging you all, as I talk about any of these, as we review any of these topics and concepts, to really start toggling between an individual experience and sensation and the collective individual experience and sensation or practice. So, surprise, hopefully it's not a surprise. We live in a white supremacist culture. And I'm gonna go more into that and break it down for us all so that we are all on the same page and can move from this training with common language. So right now on the slide, there's an image of a fish in a fish tank with some water, and the text reads, "The longer you swim in a culture, the more invisible it becomes." And I really love this image because that to me is emblematic of our experience of culture and white supremacy culture. Some of us are very acutely aware of what's around us in terms of racial inequities. And some of us aren't and are just becoming aware of how white supremacy culture characteristic shows up for us in our daily lives. Because no matter what, whether we're aware of it or not, it's still around us, right? It's still impacting us. So culture are the beliefs, values, norms, and standards of a group, community, town, state, nation, right? It's kind of that large set of norms and practices. spoken and unspoken. And then I just go a little bit deeper into organizational culture. Same concept, right? It's the norms, assumptions, values, the tangible artifacts of organizations, members, and behaviors. And I feel like in organizations, it can even be harder sometimes to pinpoint what our culture is. But we all have a sense of it, right? So I want to give you 2 minutes, and I have not been timing myself. So I hope I'm on track or where I need to be. I'm going to give you all 2 minutes, and I just ask you to reflect on the values, beliefs, and norms of the council. What makes up the council's culture? And that just can be like writing on a piece of paper for yourself or typing on a Word doc. Just giving you 2 minutes. And if you're in the public and watching along and want to participate, you also I welcome you to take these 2 minutes to write out what is the culture of your organization. So those are the norms, the values, the beliefs that make up the council. I have about a minute left. So about five seconds left to just wrap up your thought, your bullet points. And you're just going to hold on to that for yourself. And I encourage you all, having participated in this training now officially, to bring this conversation back up amongst yourselves, whether, again, that's at a committee meeting or another council meeting. Thank you for participating. So why should government lead with race? Before I get into the nitty gritty of the characteristics of white supremacy culture and then moving into systems thinking, I want to ground us in why. Like, why am I here? Why is this position here? Why do we have the equity committee, right, on the council? Why is there a racial equity statement in the strategic framework? And it's really important for us to come back to remembering why, because this is what drives our work together, right? So I'm building off of the work from GARE, the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. The council staff have been participating in GARE's programming for a few years now, and GARE provides trainings, workshops, tools for government agencies to dive deeply and to commit explicitly to racial equity. And the reasoning is because from the inception of our country, government at the local, regional, state, and federal level have played a role in creating and maintaining racial inequity. And despite progress in addressing explicit discrimination, racial inequities continue to be deep, pervasive, and persist across the country. Our opportunity is to implement policy change at multiple levels and across multiple sectors to drive larger systemic change. And what's important about that is that long-term change policy must be sustained. And to sustain those changes, we must have partnerships. And that's why it's so important to us to lead with race, to be race explicit, but not race exclusive. And that is directly from Race Forward. I've participated in many of their trainings, and that I think is the nuance that helps all of us get on board with centering racial equity. Again, explicit, meaning we understand that by disaggregating data and pulling out racial demographics in terms of outcomes, we can have a better idea of how to create solutions for our most impacted communities. It does not mean that we are excluding any other community members, but by prioritizing our most impacted community members, we are actually improving the outcomes for all of us. So now we have a brief framing of culture. We understand, we remember why you all, right, as the stewards of this public agency, as the California Arts Council, are leading with racial equity. Now we're going to jump into understanding white supremacy culture together. White supremacy culture teaches us overtly and covertly that whiteness holds value. It creates a spectrum of value. Whiteness is value and Blackness is valueless. It teaches us this overtly and covertly. It teaches us that Blackness is not only valueless, but it is also dangerous and threatening. It teaches us that Indigenous people and communities no longer exist. It teaches us to disconnect from ourselves, each other, our planet. And it's really about also driving fear. White supremacy culture really drives on fear so that we can be disconnected from ourselves, each other, and our planet. I am taking, again, like I said, I'm all about the lineage. So there's this really amazing in-depth article and website called Divorcing White Supremacy Culture, compiled by Tema Oken. And I highly recommend all of the council members to review this article. I draw upon it all the time. And what's great about it is that not only does Tema talk about the characteristics of white supremacy culture, which I'll go over briefly now, they also talk about antidotes, right? How to counteract, how to dismantle, how to interrupt white supremacy culture. So someone on our team, if you can give me a time check, that would be awesome.
I'll do that. I can do that for you.
Okay.
So since the director's report and the chair's report were really short, we have until 12:20 for this, but you probably want to end somewhere around 11:15, 11:30 at the latest. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you. All right, y'all. So now I have to recap back where I was. So what's great about Tema's work is that not only does she share with us how white supremacy culture looks on the day-to-day and in our organizations, in our institutions, in our larger culture, but she also talks about antidotes, right? So I'm just gonna go over a few of these characteristics. I really do hope this is a review for everyone. And if not, again, go to that link in my presentation and read up. So some characteristics of white supremacy culture, I have them in the green bubbles, and then I have the antidotes in the yellow bubbles. So some examples are perfectionism, one right way, paternalism, objectivity. Then those are separate, but they're related. We have the worship of the written word. We have qualified as a characteristic. We have fear. We have either or and the binary. Progress is bigger or more. Quantity over quality. So I'll dive into share a few examples. I wanted to ground this in the council's work. So I pulled a few examples related to the council. And So paternalism. Paternalism is the practice of believing and having the power to impact others based on the belief that you know best for someone else. So it's that kind of like, I have the power and I have the decision making, I have the resources to direct you and to like override what you think you know, of what your needs are. So one way that most philanthropy is kind of set up, is established through white supremacy culture, right? Where none of us are exempt from white supremacy culture in a larger sphere. And one way that the council could practice being less paternalistic is in the aspirations you have already articulated, that there's a desire to increase the general operating or multi-year grants. And that's super exciting, because what that does is that gives the agency back to grantees, because the grantees know how to best use their funds and know their capacity and know their communities. The racial equity practice there is sharing power, is giving the agency back, or just allowing grantees to be in their agency around how they decide to use their funds. Yeah, so that's one characteristic of white supremacy culture. The other I'll highlight, and one antidote at the same time. The other practice or characteristic I'll highlight, sorry, like, where are you? Either or. I'm really drawn to either or as a characteristic because I find myself going in that pattern all the time, and I have to check myself. It is not this or that. So either or is presenting options or issues as either good or bad, right or wrong, with us, against us, belonging, not belonging. And all of that is used to simplify really complex situations or issues, right? So creating a dichotomy where there's way more nuance to a situation. So I'll bring this back to the council, right? There has been an arc of conversations where the council started to create and started to fall into this false dichotomy between serving everyone's needs and prioritizing people of color in grant making. And whether or not it was pitted against that way, that's kind of the narrative that was starting to evolve. And it made it seem like it was an all or you serve all or people of color, when that is not the reality, right? And the reality is racial equity is about providing focused support so that outcomes for everyone can improve. So an example of that evolution for the council is through CARES funding, right? So when the CARES funding came down through federal support and then to the state level, the governor really articulated that we need these funds to go to the communities that are most impacted disproportionately by the pandemic. And all the data at that time, and even today, continues to point to communities of color across California being the most disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And a beautiful evolution of the council was that the council decided to focus the funding to the SLPs, the state local partners, and specifically designated these funds to go to communities of color within the different regions. That was an act of radical imagination for the council. That was a break from this arc of either or thinking. And that's huge. So I want to encourage the council to continue to move in that trajectory. It is not either everyone or communities of color. That's not the reality. That is a system of white supremacy culture thinking. And we want to leave that behind and be more expansive, right? By supporting communities of color, communities who have been most disproportionately impacted. At this time, it was by the pandemic. What can we do? We can do a lot, right? We've gotten feedback from SLPs who have said this has really encouraged us to think about our work differently. So just those are just like two examples of white supremacy culture characteristics that could show up or have shown up in the council, and ways to combat them and to counteract them, and to really start to build in practices and a culture where we are centering relationships, right? We're listening to each other, we're listening to community across California. Where we are in it for the long haul, right? So an antidote to white supremacy culture characteristics is centering relationships, where something painful may come up, something that we don't disagree with, what we don't agree with comes up, and still we're holding that this relationship is important, and that and trusting that we can, one, working on trust, and two, using that trust so that we can resolve those issues together. Another antidote is developing a learning culture. So what does that look like for the council? Including more evaluation of any actions, right? Right now, the council is using the decision support tool, which is encouraging council members and committees to think through decisions, think through impacts, think through racial equity outcomes, and bringing that to the council meetings, right? It goes through committees to the council, full council. So continuing that, what else could the council do? Some of the practices that I use is learning how to say, I don't know, and learning how to say, can you tell me more? Can you help me understand? Those three questions or statements are huge in terms of developing a learning culture, because that means we don't know it all. We aren't going to know it all unless we work together and bring our collective in, right? Unless we ask for help. And that is part of developing a learning culture. And that is the antithesis in developing a system of racial equity rather than a system of white supremacy. Yeah, so some other characteristics, it's a full list. And the thing is that they are internal, right? Part of culture is that we've internalized them. They come up in our internal dialogue, and they come out in our interpersonal engagements. They come out in how we, in the organization's culture, right? And so on and so forth. So some other characteristics are individualism, I am the only one, a sense of urgency, defensiveness and denial, right to comfort, fear of open conflict, and power hoarding. And they all are related to each other. The reason that Tema kind of pulled them out is so that we can actually start to look at them more closely within our lives and in our organizations. Cool, let's see if there's anything else I wanted to say on that. Oh, I'll just say, like, for urgency too, that's one of the ones that also comes up for me a lot. And I think in government, we're really imbued, and in philanthropy and in the arts, you know, at all these levels, sense of urgency comes up all the time. And the sense of urgency is, right, when there's this, we have to get to this, we have to get to that. We're on a tight timeline, and it provides very little space for us to feel what the impact is for a decision, or to understand, or to center a relationship or multiple relationships. It's really kind of this one, like, I have this priority that needs to get done, and I have the timeline. Your timeline doesn't matter. You're following my timeline. Yeah, I was just, that one I have to combat all the time and check myself. And I've actually, I encourage the council, looking at the aspirations, I saw that there was a council timeline that you all have been developing and working on. And I believe timelines are super important because they make explicit what the expectations are, right? And they provide hopefully enough time to thoughtfully engage those most impacted by the decision. I also wanted to say that all of these, like I said, can live in the conscious and subconscious level. And that's why we've been seeing an uptick over the last like 10 years or more of implicit bias trainings, right? I'm always trying to place where the implicit bias trainings are coming in, and they're right here. All of these characteristics and behaviors, for most of us, they're subconscious. Some of us use them consciously, and some cultures use them consciously, but typically they're subconscious. So they're kind of sitting behind and just motivating our behaviors without us thinking about them. And that's part of why we're diving into it with the council today, because I am hoping that you all can take this language and take these tools and be more explicit when you see white supremacy culture coming up and taking front center and being in the driver's seat of the conversation. And also providing you all with some antidotes, right? Some counteracting behaviors. Okay, so time for reflection. I've been talking a lot. So if you all could take 2 minutes to pick one of the white supremacy culture characteristics and to write about how it shows up in your daily life and in the council. And this, again, is just for you all. And if you're participating as a public member, as a member of the public, please feel free to participate as well. So 2 minutes to pick one of the characteristics of white supremacy culture, and I'll go back so you can see them. And write about how it shows up in your daily life and the council. And I'll scroll to the next slide so you can see that one too. Okay, about 30 seconds left. So again, my intention is that this is, either a refresher for you all, or if it's new, a starting off point. So I hope that you're able to share some of these reflections with each other, either at a council committee council, or at another council meeting. I wanted to pause here because I do have a little bit of time and see if there were any general questions from the council about anything that I have covered. I can't see folks, so if you could just unmute yourself and speak your question, that would help me.
I can help you too if I can see someone before you do.
I have a question.
Yeah, Kathy.
I just want to know if we're going to get this PowerPoint. Yeah, we'll get this?
Yes.
Good. Yeah, I think it's really important. Thank you so much, Catherine.
My pleasure. Any questions on the content or observations? Anyone want to share what those reflections were like? Yeah, I see Lilia.
I just, first of all, thank you, Catherine. This has been really helpful in focusing the direction for the council as we plan programming. I think particularly important. But I also just want to share the point that was made with regard to urgency. And I think I struggle with that a lot as a council member. I think I get it sometimes because there's a budget process. There's this timeline. We have to make decisions by this date because grant programs have to get out. And so while it's real, I recognize that the timeline is important, but I also appreciate that in this process this year, that we've given ourselves some time for both the public and the council to consider things and talk about things before we just jump to make decisions. So thank you for clarifying this and placing it in this context.
Yeah, thank you all for doing that work. And that's exactly it, right? There's always more work to do, and celebrating those moves when we can say we need to pause. We actually need to talk to our community. We need to hear from our community. We need to hear from each other. I think I can take one more comment, and I think I see Don. Okay, Jody, and we'll make it quick. Jody, and then Don.
Thank you so much. This is really beautiful. And I was looking at quantity and quality and how that would apply here, because we, what is quality and, what is quantity maybe is a little different here, because we are trying to steward the money to as many places as possible to really get to where it isn't getting. And so that's, yeah, I was just trying to figure out how those two would apply here.
Yeah, I feel like that's a great conversation for the council to have. I'm so curious. So if someone could help keep notes and tag that question, I have my thoughts, but thank you, Jody. And Don?
Yes, thank you, Catherine. I was going to say that the Temo Kun paper is really, really a special piece of work. Long before I knew that it was going to be a popular piece, I came across it in a workshop and thought this describes office culture. It describes many of the organizational cultures I've been part of so precisely that it really is a valuable document to use as you're trying to analyze your own organization. And all the things that you mentioned here are really, the micro actions that we need to take that will create a macro situation that's better. So I do think we have some excellent tools and some excellent insight into the kinds of problems we have. But you also have to be committed to the details, committed to doing it right every time, and understand how this plays out in our daily lives. But I do want to compliment that paper.
Yes, thank you, Don. Yeah, I can't speak highly enough of that article, that piece of material. Thank you for your questions and observations, everyone.
Catherine, can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Ayana. I just wanted to, I did see Chelo's hand. I just wanted to see if you wanted to.
Oh.
Call
Sorry, Cello. Yeah. Do you want to hop in?
I'll be quick. Yeah, I just want to say thank you very much. As you know, I serve on the equity committee with Kathy Gallegos, and this is a really excellent tool. And when you brought up culture of the council, I really appreciate the culture and the practice of the decision support making tool. I know that we're just starting to implement it, but it is such a great model for slowing down when we can, because I know, Lilia, we have great urgencies as well. But just the practice of trying to slow down and make sure that you ask those questions to make the right decision for equity. So I just want to say thank you for these additional tools.
Yeah, my pleasure. Luckily, I get to call this my job. And I am very lucky for that. So we're about halfway. I want to invite you all to center. This was a lot, right? Talking about culture, talking about white supremacy culture is a lot. So I encourage you, I'm going to read an excerpt from Beyond Survival. Oh, let me get the full name of this. Beyond Survival, Strategies and Stories from the Transformative Justice Movement, edited by Ajiris Dixon and Leah Lakshmi. So as I read this excerpt, I invite you all to do what you need to come back to yourself or to center, whether that's deep belly breaths, whether that's drinking some water, whether that's stretching. So I'm going to read the excerpt and invite you all to find what you need right now. An invitation to center. be here, be all over the place, be messy, be wrong, be bold in your hopefulness, be confused in community, be reaching past isolation, be part of the problem, be hungry for after, be helpful in the midst, be so early in the process, be broken by belief, be bolstered by brave comrades, be unbelievably ready, be alive. Just bringing in some art into our and embodied into our practice today. So systems thinking, right? The process of putting it all together and seeing how all the pieces relate. I'm gonna come back to the fractal, and I'm coming back to emergent strategy, because I think the fractal for me is one of the simplest and most complex ways to think about systems thinking. The fractal is the relationship between the small and the large, right? It goes back and forth. It's a never-ending pattern. Fractals are infinitely complex patterns that are self-similar across different scales. They are created by repeating a simple process over and over in an ongoing feedback loop. And that to me is kind of that's essential piece of systems thinking. And it's all over, right? So how I relate to myself mirrors out into how I relate to others, mirrors out into how we relate as a team, mirrors out into how we relate to community and to other institutions. And, you know, it mirrors back. What is a system? A system is made up of interrelated parts, components and elements that interact and produce intended and unintended outcomes. So kind of going back to the decision support tool again, right? It talks about what are the outcomes and thinking through, like, really, what are the impacts? A system is relational, it's alive, there are patterns, there are outcomes over time, it's cumulative, and we are part of them, right? There are many systems that we are part of, again, like the culture that we don't see or we don't focus on. And I'm encouraging you all to think as the council, right, as you all have articulated that by bringing your attention to the system that you're trying to change and impact, that actually starts with, as Dawn said, kind of those micro moments and is cumulative, right? Builds this kind of larger change. I love this image by Canyon Sayers Rhodes, Coyote Woman. I linked to her website here also, and I call it the racism flower, but I don't think that's what she calls it. But it's, you know, the text says it's all connected. And it's this beautiful layered Venn diagram with capitalism in the middle and racism as a petal, imperialism as a petal, settler colonialism, environmental terrorism, hierarchy. And it has these, in the in-betweens of these petals, it has kind of these systems of these hierarchy of power, right? Patriarchy, misogyny, man destroys nature, individual over community, white supremacy. So it's all connected. So as I was putting together this presentation and training for you all, I really wanted to also be able to provide you all with tools to articulate the context, right? What is around us, white supremacy culture is around us, and also to articulate the visions for the next system that won't necessarily replace white supremacy culture, because we don't want to switch them out. We want something different, right? We want something where it's a system of racial equity. And for me, when I was thinking about that, I thought of the Three Sisters gardening. And Three Sisters, if folks aren't familiar, is this indigenous practice of growing corn, beans, and squash together. And it's magical. It's magical because it's a system in itself. Each element, each being has its role and has a gift that it receives from the other being. So they work in this beautiful systemic way. The corn is tall, has a sturdy stalk, is able to create space for the bean to climb up so that it can receive some of the sun. The bean has rhizomes, I believe, that help to bring nitrogen into the soil. I am not a gardener. I am just really nerdy about plants. So if you are like, that needs some correction, feel free to add into that. But the beans help to bring nitrogen into the soil so that all three of these plants can thrive. The squash sprawls its leaves out and helps to keep the moisture into the soil, right? So we have sun, we have nitrogen-rich soil, and we have moist soil. And these beings are able to not only coexist, but really be interdependent upon each other. And for me, I want to appreciate that we have a racial equity statement in our strategic framework. And one of the pieces that I wanted to ground in today was understanding. The council wrote this into the strategic framework, that to enact policy in a just and equitable manner considers critical issues of implicit bias and discrimination that require concerted and purposeful action, right? This conversation is part of that concerted and purposeful action. The decision support tool at committees is a purposeful and concerted action. Continuing to bring up and understand the council's culture together, you all, is a concerted and purposeful action. And I also want to underline that it's all about just policy, right? What is it that you all are putting into place that is going to have a long-term sustained impact? Just checking my notes. And again, I want to ground in what you all have been having conversations about and encourage you to move in those directions as you all see that it fits into a system of racial equity. So in the aspirations, in the grant making kind of bubble, you all have articulated exploring general operating and multi-year grants. And we already talked about how that could be a wonderful antidote, right, to paternalistic grant making. But what if that aspiration of producing and funding more general operating multi-year grants could be connected to a system of advisory work groups? What values would you all start to create and to co-create, right? What beliefs and norms would be embodied in that process? So I'm encouraging you all, I know you all are already talking about your aspirations, but to like have this image of a system of racial equity. What are the critical connections that are here presented in the aspirations? We know that these pieces and these activities are not alone. They're not siloed. They're not individual actions. So what is the system of racial equity that you all want to experiment with? How are these pieces interrelated? And that's for further conversation for you all. All right, so we're gonna move into the last piece, which is really looking at this tool, the systems approach Iceberg. I was introduced to this model. Like I said, I've learned a lot from Race Forward. I highly recommend their trainings. They have 2 foundations of racial equity trainings. And it's like basic language, historical context, and then more into like systems thinking. So they introduced this Iceberg. And for them, they were actually looking at the dimensions of structural racism. So right, the concept of this model in terms of systems thinking approach is that there's an event at the top. There's an event or action or decision that is very clear that people can see. That's observable. And then underneath that, there are underlying structures. There's culture, there's history, there's interconnected institutions and policies, and there's racial ideology that sustains and is part of and is connected to this one event. I'm going to share a few like iterations of this model so you all can kind of see. I like different examples, so I'm sharing different examples with you all. So again, right, we have the event. So what just happened? This example uses catching a cold. So the event is you caught a cold. Underneath that is the pattern or the trends. So what trends have been there over time, right? This is usually like over time. What can you observe over time? I've been catching more colds while also sleeping less. And then we have our underlying structures, right? So what has influenced these patterns? What are the relationships between the parts? So there's more stress at work. I haven't been eating well. It's hard to access healthy food near home or at work. And then mental models. So what assumptions, beliefs, norms do people hold about this system? So again, kind of like that culture piece, right? Identifying the culture with mental models, what's kind of driving these actions, what beliefs keep the system in place. Career is the most important piece of our identity, healthy food is too expensive, and rest is for the unmotivated. So that's just one example of the model. I also found this while I was looking for examples. This is a charter school that uses a systems thinking approach to teach about slavery in colonial America. And I was like, whoa, I wish I had that in 8th grade. I'm just learning about it now. So at this school, they talk about the visible roles, right? There are landowners, indentured servants, and enslaved people. And then they have their underlying structures and mental models. So underlying structures including the plantation system, mercantile economic system, slave trade system, and laws to keep enslaved people captured. Mental models underneath the visible roles and the underlying structures are concepts of wealth, competition, zero-sum economics. There's some more, and I just wanted to share this example because I thought it was really cool that 8th graders were learning about systems thinking, especially through like understanding chattel slavery. So I went through my own process and practice, and I actually pulled from something that happened here that is related to the CAC. I also want to give you all time to kind of go through your own Iceberg model. So I'm just going to quickly go over this, and maybe on a piece of paper, y'all can start to like jot down an event. So the events that I picked, I'll just have you all reflect on this actually, is for the first time this year, the CAC required a racial equity statement as part of the eligibility requirement for organizational applicants. So I'm going to give you all, I'm going to go back to the, I'm going to go back to this diagram because I feel like it's a really good explainer, and give you just like 2 minutes to start to write out that event, right? For the first time, we required a racial equity statement. And then if you all could just go and answer these questions down the line. What trends have been there? What are the influencing patterns? What are the relationships between the parts? And what assumptions, beliefs, and values do people hold? So just go through the exercise of the event is the CAC for the first time required a racial equity statement from all organizational applicants, and just go down answering these questions. So right now we're at patterns and trends. So what patterns and trends have been there over time? I'll try to give you a few, like maybe 20, 30 seconds per question, per level. So patterns or trends, what trends have been there over time? If you're ready, I encourage you to move to the next level of underlying structures. So what has influenced these patterns? What are the relationships between the parts? Again, the event is the racial equity statement requirement. And the next level down is, or next level set of questions is mental models. So what assumptions, beliefs, and values do people hold about the system? What beliefs keep the system in place? And again, this is just for you all to start like playing with these tools.
And Catherine, excuse me, you have about 10 more minutes.
Perfect. I'm about 10 minutes to wrap. Thank you. I hope you're okay. All right. So again, I will share all these slides and these will have all the links to the resources that I pulled from. And, oh, that's funny. Okay. I encourage you all to practice. This is one of the tools for me when I was going through this training. I really see this as part of the practice of like using it in relationship to the decision support tools folks have talked about. Like what if there's a decision that's coming down the line, you could just do this on a back of a piece of scrap paper and start to think through, okay, what are the other systems that we're impacting or that are related to this one decision or event? So for me, I'll just quickly say, so the event was requiring a racial equity statement as part of the eligibility requirement for organizational applicants. For me, the patterns and trends that are visible are that large budget and white-led organizations have the resources to apply for and more often successfully receive grants, while small budget and BIPOC-led Black, Indigenous, people of color-led organizations are often under-resourced and cannot always submit successful applications, but often have strong racial equity outcomes as foundation to their work. Another pattern is that the CAC wants to provide more support to small budget and BIPOC-led organizations. I've heard this in council meetings many times. Another part of this is that to see the trends, the CAC is starting to collect and review disaggregated data. On the underlying structures level, for me, again, I see large budget and white-led organizations are more likely to have staff capacity to advocate. Doesn't matter like for what, they have the capacity, right? That's kind of part of the structure, they're built up. There's a history of systemic racism in philanthropy and government, which has created more barriers for BIPOC-led organizations to access funding. There's also an underlying structure that council members come from different backgrounds and different levels of education on racial equity practices and systems change. Some of the mental models that I thought of while thinking about this one event is that open competitive grant making is the fairest process, right? Fair grant making is equivalent to equal across population. Some people in California don't believe in systemic racism or that it only impacts people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color. Another mental model is that could be that anyone in the public can access the CAC because we're a public agency. Oh, and you can't really see this, sorry. The nonprofit industrial complex and the arts is not part of white supremacy culture. We're kind of exempt, you know. Not in real life, I'm just saying that these could be some of the mental models, not in my understanding of the world. So I invited you all to kind of go through that practice. I created a Jamboard for you all, which I hope to share with you at some point, if that's cool. And Jamboard is this awesome online tool. I am a big fan of Post-it notes in meetings, and this is the digital version of that. So if you haven't seen it before, it's the coolest tool ever, and you can all do it at the same time. It's really beautiful. So this is just a screenshot of that. So I have some time for a few questions, and then I want to do a recap. So that was really quick going through like a couple of approaches. Are there like maybe one or two questions or observations that folks want to share?
I just want to thank you for explaining, giving the answers from your opinion around the mental models, because I think that was the hardest one for me to grab. And it's like, when I saw it, I went, oh, of course, that's what that means. It's a belief system. It's belief systems. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's so deep and underlying. And it's like at the root of conversations all the time, are these massive mental differences around it. That's not true. That's not true. Right? That kind of, anyway, so thank you for that, Catherine.
Yeah, no problem. We're all doing this together and figuring out the definitions and coming up with common understandings, right? And yeah, it took me a while to get to like, wait, what is the underlying belief system of all of this? Maybe one more question or comment. I don't know if I see any other hands. Oh, okay.
I don't see any other hands so far.
All good. Great. So I'll move into our recap. So to recap, these are all the things hopefully you walked away with. So council members will see the relationship between government, white supremacy culture, and racial equity practices. I provided an overview of white supremacy culture characteristics. You all had a little bit of time to reflect on how those show up in the council and in your daily life. We also provided some racial equity practices to counteract, interrupt, and dismantle white supremacy culture in hopes of creating systems of racial equity. We reviewed that government played a role in creating and maintaining racial inequity. And because of government's ability to create and impact policy, right? Because you all are stewarding the California Arts Council public agency, you all have the responsibility and privilege and honor to lead explicitly with race and not exclusively centered race, right? The next outcome is to expand council's toolbox for racial equity. So I provided different models, different practices throughout the presentation, including how to, like, talking about centering relationships, talking about the 3 systems gardening process, and oh my gosh, I'm flashing back. I don't remember the other practices. Anyone else name maybe one of the other practices, racial equity practices they heard today? Not meant to be a pop quiz. I just need help remembering. All right, I trust you all took notes. Council members will see how systems thinking fits into their decision making. So you all were articulating this already, right? Really diving into the decision support tool. How even talking about culture, right, is a new conversation. And thinking kind of more about the different impacts of your decisions as council.
Catherine, can I jump in for 1 second? Just because you talked about practices, I really think that the discussion about the decision support tool as a racial equity practice is completely spot on. Something that the council is doing, we're doing as staff. And it also relates to me, very keenly and very kind of the correlation between the decision support tool and how it's set up and the questions that are asked feels very, very much like a kind of a systems thinking approach. If you look at the Iceberg model and you look at the questions that are asked in the decision support tool, there's clearly a correlation. So I think that practice that the council's adopted and that we're adopting as a staff really relates to that iceberg kind of a systems thinking model. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Thank you, Ayana. I'm like, I know there's more connections there. Cool. And then I meant to provide you all with an opportunity to, to identify the next time you would use a systems thinking approach. And I think you elaborated on that, Ayana, that the next time you will use the decision support tool is the next time that you're also going to be using a systems thinking approach. And I do encourage you all to just practice with that model, right? That iceberg image, because I've been doing it now and I'm like, oh my gosh, what's coming up for me? So thank you all so much for your time. I want to close with the beautiful words of Octavia Butler. All that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. And yeah, I look forward to answering any other questions or being in conversation with you all more. Thank you.